In this video, I want to talk about the basic concepts around GraphQL. What is GraphQL? What are the building blocks of GraphQL? How it came into existence. So let's get started. First, a bit of history. So back in 2012, Facebook was struggling with the performance of its applications, the mobile apps, because fetching data was an issue. It was creating a bottleneck. The apps were slow because a lot of data was being fetched, and when you're fetching a lot of data, there is a delay, and that leads to performance issues. Now, if you are familiar with REST, right, RESTful APIs, then RESTful APIs have been very popular and solved a lot of use cases, but they have a couple of drawbacks. One is overfetching. Like when you call a REST API, you get pretty much the same amount of data each time. You can't really select the data that you want. And the second problem is underfetching. Sometimes you have to make multiple calls to different APIs to get related data. We'll talk about this more. Now, those two were the key problems which GraphQL solves. It takes the ideas that were developed to query databases and applies to internet. With GraphQL, you have the option to select what data you want, and also you can get related data in a single response. So when you build a GraphQL API, for example, you you are pretty much telling the user that these are the bits of data that you can select from. Okay, I think when we look at the practical example, you'll get a better idea of what I'm trying to say. But the important thing is when you think of GraphQL, it's helpful to think about databases also. If you're familiar with database, you'll easily understand GraphQL concepts. Like you use SQL to get data from database. Similarly, you can use the query language. GraphQL means graph query language. So you can use the graph query language to get data from APIs or data sources. Now, as I mentioned, it takes ideas from database. So think of it this way. GraphQL is basically defining a schema. In database also, you define a schema, right? A schema is like a collection of tables, right? And in those tables, you can store data, which can be interrelated. Similarly, in GraphQL, you define a schema, which is like a representation of your data, the data structure that you want to expose to the end user, right? And this schema has a set of types. Types are, you can think of types like tables. They define the structure of your data. Let's look at an example. Here you can see in database you may have two tables like customer table and order table, right? And in GraphQL, similarly, you can have the customer type and the order type. The customer type has two fields here, name, which is of type string, and age, which is of type number, similar to the way you define a table, right, in a database. And then you have a type order, which actually links to the customer table. So here you have a customer field, which is actually of type customer. You have city and you have order ID. And the way you represent this type when you define a GraphQL schema, which we'll look at in the next tutorial, in the next session, in that you write like a simple JavaScript key value pair, like type customer, name is the key, string is the type, age is the key, number is the type. Now, the good part is when you want to query, for example, you have created this schema, right, for customer and for order. When you want to query, then you can exactly get a similar representation of the data. I think I'll clarify it more to you in a short while. Now, what are the core building blocks of GraphQL? You have two key things. One is schema and the other is resolvers. Okay, schema we just talked about. Resolvers are nothing but how you get data which you want to expose to the client. For example, in the previous case, you have this customer type, right? But how do you get the data? From where will you get the data for this customer? You may have a database, you may have an API, and the way you get that data is defined by your resolvers. So your resolvers actually give you the data for a particular um, schema type, right? So these are like the core building blocks of GraphQL, and I think in the following lecture, I'll take a concrete example. We'll build something from scratch, and that'll give you a pretty clear idea of how GraphQL works and how you can use it. See you there. Bye.